Water splashes crimson as a bullet tears through the surface of the creek. In the harsh Dakota territory of 1884, water isn't just sustenance, it's power. It divides those who take and those who protect. It carries life in its flow and death in its absence. A widow stands alone on her porch, rifle in hand, watching as distant riders approach through the morning mist. The irrigation system her husband built is all that stands between prosperity and ruin, between peace and bloodshed, for two worlds bound by a single creek. They say gold sleeps beneath the stream bed. They say progress demands sacrifice. They say a woman alone cannot stand against the tide of men's ambitions. But they don't know about the fire that burns when everything you love is threatened. They don't understand that some boundaries once crossed transform ordinary souls into warriors. In this valley where water carves the earth, blood will soon follow the same path, revealing who will survive when the delicate balance between two peoples is shattered by greed. The winter of 1884 had been harsh on Black Creek Valley. Sarah Blackwood stood on her porch, wrapping a worn shawl tightly around her shoulders as she surveyed what remained of her land. At 45, her face was etched with the fine lines of someone who had weathered both the Dakota elements and life's cruelties, yet her eyes remained clear and determined. The morning sun caught the silver strands in her dark hair, pulled back in a practical bun that spoke of utility over vanity. She watched as the creek that gave the valley its name snaked through her property, its waters flowing swift and cold with the spring melt. That creek was more than just water. It was life itself, the beating heart of everything her husband Michael had built before consumption claimed him 3 winters past. Sarah took a deep breath of the crisp morning air and descended the porch steps, her boots crunching on the half-frozen mud. The irrigation system Michael had designed was showing signs of strain after years without his expert maintenance. As a military engineer, he had created something remarkable: channels and gates that directed water precisely where it was needed, when it was needed. Now without him, the wooden sluices were rotting in places, metal hinges rusting, and Sarah's limited carpentry skills were barely keeping the system functional. She knelt by a leaking joint, her fingers working methodically to tighten the binding. The creek water was icy against her skin, but she barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, as it often was during these solitary morning tasks, remembering Michael's hands guiding hers as he taught her the workings of his system, his voice patient and kind. "The water doesn't just feed our land, Sarah," he'd told her. "It feeds the Lakota lands downstream too. Their sacred grounds depend on this flow just as much as our crops do." Michael had understood something many settlers failed to grasp, that the land and its resources weren't simply there for the taking. He had forged a rare friendship with the Lakota tribe that lived beyond the northern ridge, particularly with their chief Dakota. The relationship had been built on mutual respect and a shared understanding of the water's importance. Sarah finished her repairs and stood wiping her hands on her apron. From this vantage point, she could see all the way to the edge of her property where the creek continued its journey toward the Lakota lands. The thought of their connection to this place always stirred memories she tried to keep buried, of the army camp where she had worked as a nurse, of the cholera that had swept through, and of her son Thomas, just 7 years old, slipping away, despite everything she knew, everything she tried. The helplessness she had felt then had hardened something in her, created a deep-seated loathing for those in power who turned blind eyes to suffering when it was inconvenient. It was why she had little patience for the politicians and businessmen who now seemed intent on reshaping the Dakota territory in their own image, with little regard for those who called it home. Sarah was halfway back to the house when she heard the approaching horses, 3 riders coming hard down the road that led to her property. She recognized the lead rider, immediately Wilkins, the sheriff of nearby Fort Creek. Behind him rode 2 men she didn't know, both dressed in the fine clothes of city dwellers rather than the practical garb of the frontier. She straightened her back and waited for them to reach her, one hand instinctively moving to the pocket where she kept a small derringer, a habit born of necessity for a woman living alone in such isolated country. "Morning, Sarah," Sheriff Wilkins called, tipping his hat as the riders slowed to a stop. Despite his friendly greeting, there was a tension in his face that put Sarah immediately on edge. Wilkins had been Michael's friend during the war, had even helped build this very farmhouse. But something had changed in him recently, a reluctance to meet her eyes, a formality that hadn't been there before. "Sheriff," she acknowledged with a nod. "What brings you out so early?" "Business, I'm afraid." He gestured to the men beside him. This here is Mr. Thomas Hargrove and Mr. William Ellsworth, representatives of Chester Montgomery's Dakota Development Company. Sarah's jaw tightened at the mention of Montgomery. Even out here, his reputation preceded him, a railroad tycoon and mining magnate who had been buying up land throughout the territory. The kind of man who saw the frontier not as a place to build a life, but as resources to be extracted and profits to be made. Mrs. Blackwood, the older of the two men, Hargrove said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. A pleasure to make your acquaintance. What does Mr. Montgomery want with my land? Sarah asked, ignoring the pleasantries. Hargrove cleared his throat. Mr. Montgomery recognizes the unique potential of Black Creek Valley. He's prepared to make you a very generous offer for your property, twice its assessed value. My land isn't for sale, Sarah replied flatly. Perhaps you should consider the offer before dismissing it. Ellsworth, the younger man, interjected. A woman alone might find it difficult to maintain such a large property. The irrigation system alone must be quite a burden. Sarah felt a flare of anger. I've managed just fine for 3 years, Mr. Ellsworth, and I intend to manage for many more. Mrs. Blackwood, Hargrove tried again, surely you must recognize the opportunities this sale would afford you. You could relocate to Fort Creek or even Bismarck. Live comfortably without, my husband built this place with his own hands. Sarah cut him off. The water system he designed helps not just this farm, but the Lakota lands beyond. I won't sell to a man who would redirect that water solely for his own profit. Sheriff Wilkins shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Sarah, be reasonable. Montgomery is not the kind of man who takes no for an answer. The implied threat wasn't lost on Sarah. She fixed Wilkins with a hard stare. Is that why you're here, Sheriff, to threaten me on behalf of a man who's never even set foot on my land? I'm here because it's my job to keep the peace, Wilkins said, his voice low. And I'm telling you as someone who was once a friend to your husband that you should consider this offer carefully. My answer is still no, Sarah said firmly. Now, if you gentlemen will excuse me, I have work to do. Hargrove's smile tightened. We'll leave the details of the offer with you, Mrs. Blackwood. I encourage you to review them. He removed an envelope from his coat pocket and extended it toward her. Sarah made no move to take it. After a moment, Hargrove placed it on a fence post. Montgomery will be disappointed, Ellsworth said, his voice carrying an edge now. He's set his sights on this valley. Then Mr. Montgomery will have to learn that not everything he sets his sights on can be bought, Sarah replied. The men exchanged glances and with brief nods turned their horses and started back down the road. Only Wilkins lingered. This isn't like you, Jack, Sarah said quietly. Michael considered you a brother. Wilkins wouldn't meet her gaze. Times change, Sarah. The territory's changing. Men like Montgomery, they're the future, whether we like it or not. Not on my land, they're not. Wilkins finally looked at her, and there was something like regret in his eyes. I can't protect you if you make yourself his enemy. I never asked for your protection, Sarah said, only for the law to be upheld. But it seems that's too much to ask these days. Without another word, Wilkins turned his horse and rode away, leaving Sarah alone with the envelope on the fence post. She took it and tore it in half without opening it, letting the pieces flutter away in the wind. 3 days later, Sarah woke to the sound of explosions. She bolted upright in bed, momentarily disoriented, until a second blast rocked the house, rattling the windows in their frames. She grabbed her shotgun from beside the bed and rushed to the window, peering out into the pre-dawn darkness. In the dim light, she could make out figures moving near the main irrigation dam, the critical control point Michael had built to regulate the creek's flow. There was a flash of light followed by another explosion, and Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized what was happening. They were destroying the dam. She dressed hastily, loaded the shotgun, and slipped out the back door. Moving silently through the shadows, Sarah worked her way toward the creek, using the trees and undergrowth for cover. As she drew closer, voices became audible, rough, unfamiliar voices punctuated by laughter and the occasional curse. Make sure it's completely unusable, one voice ordered. Montgomery wants the water flowing freely by morning. Sarah crouched behind a large boulder, her heart pounding as she peered around its edge. In the growing light, she could see 6 men, all armed, working methodically to place what looked like dynamite charges around the remaining structure of the dam. Several horses were tethered nearby, nervous and stamping at the noise. She recognized none of them, but the name they'd mentioned was enough. Montgomery had decided not to wait for her answer. Instead, he'd sent men to destroy the irrigation system, probably hoping that without it, she'd have no choice but to sell. Sarah's grip tightened on her shotgun. 6 against 1 were terrible odds, but the dam was too important to lose, not just for her farm, but for the Lakota lands downstream that depended on the regulated flow. She was considering her options when a new voice spoke from the shadows near the horses. "That's enough dynamite to blow half the creek to kingdom, come not just the dam." The men turned toward the voice as a figure stepped into view, tall, lean, with a weather-beaten face and eyes that seemed to reflect the dawn light. He wore a duster that had seen better days and carried a pistol with practiced ease. "Who asked you, Van Cleef?" one of the men shot back. Montgomery hired the Van Cleef gang to pressure the widow not to destroy the whole valley. The newcomer Van Cleef himself apparently replied, "Too much damage and the land becomes worthless." "Montgomery hired us to get rid of the problem," another man argued. "Without this dam, she's got nothing." Van Cleef shook his head. "Your job was to scare her, not ruin the property. Set off what you've already placed, then we're pulling back." And there was a moment of tension, and Sarah thought the men might turn on their leader. But eventually the one who'd been placing the dynamite nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but you're the one explaining to Montgomery why half the dam is still standing." "I'll handle Montgomery," Van Cleef said. "Now finish up and let's go." Sarah remained hidden as the men set the final charges, lit the fuses, and retreated to a safe distance. The resulting explosion was larger than the previous ones, sending water and debris high into the air. When the dust settled, Sarah could see that while the main control gates were destroyed, the core structure of the dam remained intact. It would take weeks to repair, but it wasn't beyond saving. As the gang mounted their horses and rode away, Sarah stayed motionless, memorizing faces, particularly Van Cleef's. Only when they were well out of sight did she emerge from her hiding place to survey the damage. The destruction was significant. Without the control gates, the creek water would flow unchecked, potentially flooding parts of her fields, while leaving others dry. Worse, the delicate balance Michael had created to ensure steady flow to the Lakota lands would be disrupted. As she stood amid the wreckage, watching the sun rise over her damaged land, Sarah came to a decision. Montgomery had made his move. Now it was her turn. "You're on." The town of Fort Creek was bustling when Sarah rode in later that morning. The single main street was lined with the usual frontier establishments, a general store, saloon, blacksmith, and at the far end, the sheriff's office. People moved about their business, many nodding in greeting to Sarah as she passed. Despite living somewhat apart from town, she was a known figure, respected for her late husband's contributions and her own skills as a former Army nurse. She tied her horse outside the sheriff's office and entered without knocking. Wilkins was at his desk, head bent over paperwork. He looked up as the door swung shut behind her, and something like guilt flashed across his face before his expression settled into professional neutrality. "Sarah, what brings you to town?" "You know very well what brings me," she said, her voice steady, despite the anger simmering beneath. "Montgomery's men blew up my dam this morning." Wilkins sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Do you have proof it was Montgomery's men?" "They said his name plain as day. Called themselves the Van Cleef gang." A flicker of recognition passed across Wilkins' face at the name. "The Van Cleef gang operates throughout the territory. They're hired guns, not Montgomery's personal army. Don't play games with me, Jack. You warned me this would happen if I didn't sell." "Sakino." "I warned you Montgomery wasn't a man to take no for an answer," Wilkins corrected. "That's not the same as knowing he'd send men to damage your property." Sarah placed both hands on his desk, leaning forward. "Are you going to do your job, Sheriff? Or has Montgomery bought that too?" The words hung in the air between them, a challenge Wilkins seemed unwilling to meet directly. He stood slowly, reaching for his hat. "I'll ride out and take a look at the damage. File a report." "A report," Sarah repeated flatly. "And then what will you arrest Montgomery?" "The men who did this. I need evidence, Sarah. Real evidence, not just your word against theirs. And if I had that evidence," Wilkins hesitated, "then I'd do my job." Sarah studied him, trying to see past the badge to the man who had once been a friend. Whatever she was looking for, she didn't find it. "I used to believe that," she said, finally turning toward the door. My mistake. She left without looking back, the bell above the door, jingling with false cheerfulness as it closed behind her. Outside, she paused, taking a moment to collect herself before heading across the street to the general store. The proprietor, Daniel Peterson, looked up from where he was organizing a shelf of canned goods. A thin man with kind eyes, magnified by wire-rimmed spectacles, Daniel had been one of the few in town who had openly supported her stance against Montgomery's offers. Sarah, he greeted her with genuine warmth. I heard about what happened at your place. Terrible business. News travels fast, she noted. Small town, he replied with a shrug. Are you all right? No one was hurt, I hope. Just the dam, Sarah said. But without it, I can't control the water flow. My fields will flood in some places, dry out in others. Daniel moved closer, lowering his voice. Montgomery was in here yesterday, talking with some men I didn't recognize. Rough-looking types. I'd bet good money they were the ones who did this. The Van Cleef gang, Sarah supplied. Daniel nodded gravely. Bad reputation, that bunch. Led by Jackson Van Cleef, former Confederate officer, turned hired gun after the war. They say he'll do anything for the right price. Wilkins won't do anything about it, Sarah said bitterly. Claims he needs evidence. Wilkins has been in Montgomery's pocket ever since the man started buying up land around here, Daniel said with a sigh. But there might be another way. He glanced around to ensure they were alone before continuing. The federal marshal Reynolds is due in town next week. He answers to Washington, not local interests. Maybe he'd be willing to look into it. Sarah considered this. A federal marshal might indeed be beyond Montgomery's influence, but a week was a long time, long enough for Montgomery to cause more damage, perhaps irreparable this time. I need supplies, she said, changing the subject. Enough to repair what I can of the dam. Daniel nodded immediately, moving to gather what she needed. I can send my boy out to help with the repairs if you'd like. Thank you, but I can manage, Sarah replied. She hesitated, then added, though there is something else you might help me with. Do you have any paper and ink I need to write a letter? While Daniel fetched the writing supplies, Sarah mentally composed her message. Not to the federal marshal, but to Chief Dakota of the Lakota. If Montgomery's men had destroyed her dam, the water flow to the sacred Lakota grounds would be affected. They deserved to know, and perhaps in this matter at least their interests and hers aligned. As Daniel returned with paper, pen, and ink, Sarah thought of Michael's words about the creek. It doesn't just feed our lands, Sarah. It feeds the Lakota lands too. In destroying the dam, Montgomery had attacked not just her, but the Lakota as well. Perhaps together they could stand against him, or separately they might fail. The sun was setting as Sarah finished what repairs she could to the damaged dam. Her muscles ached from the day's labor, and her hands were raw despite the gloves she wore. She had managed to create a temporary solution that would prevent the worst flooding, but it was a far cry from the precise system Michael had designed. As she gathered her tools, a sound from the nearby woods made her freeze. Someone or something was moving through the underbrush, trying to be quiet but not entirely succeeding. Sarah reached slowly for the shotgun she'd kept nearby all day. I know you're there, she called out, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Show yourself. For a long moment there was silence. Then gradually a figure emerged from the trees. A man, though he moved with the awkward gait of someone in pain. In the fading light, Sarah could see that he was Native American, dressed in a mixture of traditional Lakota clothing and items that appeared to be of white origin. Blood stained his side, spreading slowly across his buckskin shirt. Help, he managed in accented English before collapsing to his knees. Sarah hesitated only a moment before setting down her shotgun and rushing to his side. Her nurse's training took over as she helped him to lie flat, examining the wound with practiced hands. Gunshot, she murmured. Clean through, at least. She looked at his face, noting the pain etched there, but also the wariness in his eyes. I'm Sarah Blackwood. This is my land. I can help you, but I need to get you to my house. The man's eyes flickered with recognition at her name. Wanblee, he said, pressing a hand to his chest. I know. Husband. Michael. Sarah's surprise must have shown on her face, for Wanblee continued. He helped our village. Water system. Yes, Sarah said, understanding dawning. You're from Dakota's village. Wanblee nodded weakly. Montgomery men. Shot me. Said I trespass. Anger flared in Sarah's chest. This wasn't trespassing. The creek runs through both our lands. She glanced at the setting sun. We need to move before it gets dark. Can you walk with help? With considerable effort and Sarah's support, Wanblee managed to stand. The journey back to her house was slow and painful, punctuated by stops when Wanblee needed to rest. By the time they reached the porch, night had fallen completely, and Wanblee was barely conscious. Inside, Sarah helped him onto the kitchen table, the best place for the surgery she would need to perform. She worked methodically, first cutting away the blood-soaked clothing, then cleaning the wound with whiskey. Wanblee remained silent throughout, though the tension in his body betrayed his pain. The bullet passed through cleanly, Sarah told him as she prepared a needle and thread. You're lucky. A little higher, and it would have hit something vital. Not luck, Wanblee said, his voice strained. Bad shot. Despite the circumstances, Sarah found herself smiling slightly. I'm going to stitch this up now. It will hurt. Wanblee nodded, bracing himself. As Sarah began to sew the wound closed, he spoke again, his words coming between carefully controlled breaths. Montgomery wants more than your land. Wants gold. Sarah's hands stilled momentarily. Gold in Black Creek. Underwater, Wanblee confirmed. His men, testing the creek bed, found traces. He paused, gathering strength. Plans to divert water, dry the creek, mine the bed. The pieces clicked into place in Sarah's mind. Montgomery's insistence on buying her land, the destruction of the dam, it wasn't just about control or territory. It was about what lay beneath the water. If he diverts the creek, she said slowly, it won't just affect my farm. It would dry up the sacred pools on your land as well. Wanblee nodded grimly. Water is life. No water. He let the implication hang in the air. Sarah resumed her stitching, her mind racing. If what Wanblee said was true, Montgomery's plans were far more destructive than she had realized. Diverting the creek would be an ecological disaster, affecting not just her farm and the Lakota lands, but potentially the entire valley ecosystem. How did you find out about this? She asked as she tied off the last stitch. I follow them, Wanblee admitted. Many days now, heard them talk, saw them test creek bed, was going to warn Dakota then. He gestured to his wound. They saw you, Sarah finished for him, applying a clean bandage. Should have been more careful. You were brave, Sarah countered, and now we know what we're facing. She helped him sit up, noticing how he winced at the movement. You need rest. You can take my son's room tonight. Wanblee looked at her with surprise. Your son? A familiar pain tightened Sarah's chest. He died, years ago. Cholera in the army camp, where I was a nurse. She busied herself with cleaning up the medical supplies, avoiding Wanblee's gaze. The room is still there. There was a moment of silence before Wanblee spoke again. I am sorry for your loss. The simple sincerity in his voice made Sarah look up. Their eyes met, and in that moment something passed between them, a recognition of shared grief perhaps, or the beginning of an understanding. Thank you, she said softly. Later, after settling Wanblee in Thomas's old room, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at the letter she had been writing to Chief Dakota earlier that day. The information Wanblee had shared changed things. This wasn't just about her dam or her farm anymore. If Montgomery was planning to divert the creek to mine for gold, the threat extended far beyond her property lines. She dipped her pen in ink and began to write again, adding what she had learned. When she was finished, she sealed the letter. Tomorrow she would ask Daniel to ensure it reached Dakota, and then she would begin preparations. Because if Montgomery wanted a fight for Black Creek Valley, Sarah Blackwood was prepared to give him one. The week that followed was a dance of tension and preparation. Sarah divided her time between tending to Wanblee's wound, reinforcing what remained of the dam, and watching for Montgomery's next move. Wanblee recovered quickly, his strength returning day by day. He proved to be not just a patient, but a valuable ally, his knowledge of the land and its hidden paths expanding Sarah's understanding of the valley she thought she knew. On the fourth day, Daniel Peterson's son arrived with a message. Dakota had received Sarah's letter and requested a meeting. The following dawn, at the ancient stone formation that marked the boundary between Sarah's land and the Lakota territory, neutral ground as it were. "Will you go?" Wombly asked as Sarah read the message. "Yes," she replied without hesitation. "This affects us both. We should face it together." Wombly nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes. "I will come with you. Dakota will want to hear what I saw." The stone formation was a natural wonder, tall, weathered pillars of rock that jutted from the earth like the fingers of some buried giant. Sarah had always found the place eerily beautiful, particularly in the half-light of dawn when shadows played between the stones and mist clung to the ground. She and Wombly arrived first, the sky just beginning to lighten in the east. They didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, the soft sound of hoofbeats announced the approach of riders. Chief Dakota appeared first, a commanding figure, even at a distance. He was older than Sarah remembered from the few times she had seen him with Michael, his face more lined, his long hair showing strands of gray. Behind him rode 4 warriors, their expressions guarded. Dakota dismounted with the fluid grace of a much younger man and approached on foot. His eyes went first to Wombly, assessing his condition before turning to Sarah. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said in perfect English, "it has been many seasons since we spoke." "Chief Dakota," Sarah greeted him with a respectful nod. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." "As do I." Dakota's gaze swept over her, taking in the shotgun she carried and the determination in her stance. "Your letter spoke of threats to the water. Wombly's absence confirmed something was wrong." "Nah, Montgomery's men shot me," Wombly explained, lifting his shirt to show the bandaged wound. "Mrs. Blackwood saved my life." Dakota's expression remained impassive, but Sarah sensed his anger at the news. "And what did you learn before they shot you?" he asked Wombly. As Wombly recounted what he had discovered about Montgomery's gold mining plans, Sarah watched Dakota's face. The chief listened without interruption, only the tightening of his jaw indicating his growing concern. "If he diverts the creek," Dakota said when Wombly had finished, "the sacred pools will dry up, the hunting grounds will wither, my people will suffer. As will my farm," Sarah added, "and every living thing that depends on Black Creek." Dakota turned to her, his eyes sharp. "Why do you come to us with this? Your people have never concerned themselves with our suffering before." The question was direct, challenging, but Sarah recognized its legitimacy. "My husband respected your people and your claim to the water. He built the irrigation system to share the creek, not to steal it." She met Dakota's gaze steadily. "I'm not asking for your help out of charity or friendship. I'm proposing an alliance against a common enemy." "And what would this alliance entail?" "Information, protection, a united front." Sarah gestured to the valley around them. "Montgomery thinks he can pick us off one by one. He doesn't expect us to work together." Dakota was silent for a long moment, considering. Finally, he spoke to Wombly in their native tongue, a rapid exchange that Sarah couldn't follow. When he turned back to her, his expression had softened slightly. "Wombly says your husband once called you the woman with the heart of a warrior. He says you faced Montgomery's men alone, that you worked to repair the dam with your own hands." Dakota studied her face. "These are not the actions of a woman seeking to trick us." "I want what Michael wanted," Sarah said simply, "for the water to flow freely and fairly for all who depend on it." Another long moment passed as Dakota weighed her words. Then unexpectedly he extended his hand to her, a gesture of white customs, not his own. "My people have a saying, the river does not ask what color the hands are that drink from it." Dakota's expression was solemn. "Michael Blackwood saved my village during the great drought. He called me brother and meant it. For his sake and for the water we both cherish, I will stand with you against this man Montgomery." Sarah took his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of a life lived close to the land, not unlike her own. "Thank you." As they sealed their alliance, the first rays of the sun broke over the horizon, casting long shadows from the stone pillars across the ground, where they stood, white woman and Lakota chief, united by a thread of water in a land where such alliances were rare indeed. Neither of them noticed the distant figure watching from the ridge above, nor the glint of morning light on the brass telescope he lowered from his eye before turning his horse and riding swiftly toward Fort Creek. The alliance was formed, but the real battle for Black Creek Valley was just beginning. And as the sun rose higher, painting the landscape in shades of gold and promise, The shadows it cast grew deeper and more ominous, harbingers of the blood that would soon flow, like water through the valley Michael Blackwood had once called home. The Lakota village nestled in a protected valley north of Black Creek was alive with activity when Sarah arrived alongside Juan Blee 3 days after their meeting with Dakota. Children paused in their play to stare at the white woman on horseback, their curious eyes following her as she rode through the center of the settlement. Women looked up from their work, some with open hostility, others with cautious interest. Warriors stood at attention, hands never far from their weapons. Sarah felt the weight of their gazes but kept her back straight, her expression composed. She had come not as a conqueror or a missionary, but as an ally, though she knew such distinctions often meant little to a people who had suffered so much at the hands of white settlers. Dakota waited at the entrance to his lodge, a large structure adorned with painted symbols that Sarah couldn't decipher. The chief's face remained impassive as they approached, though he inclined his head slightly in greeting. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said as she dismounted, "you honor us with your presence?" "Hunarnam, the honor is mine, Chief Dakota," Sarah replied, careful to match his formality. "Thank you for receiving me." Wanbley dismounted more stiffly, his wound still healing. He exchanged quiet words with Dakota in their native tongue, before the chief gestured for them both to enter his lodge. Inside, a fire burned in a central pit, its smoke rising through an opening in the roof. Several elders were already seated in a circle, including two women whose stern expressions suggested they were not pleased by Sarah's arrival. Dakota indicated that Sarah should sit opposite him, a position of respect that didn't go unnoticed by the others present. Dawn broke over Black Creek Valley, painting the sky in strokes of crimson and gold that seemed to Sarah like an omen of the bloodshed to come. She and Wanbley stood at the mouth of the cave, surveying the land below. Despite his insistence that he was fit to travel, Wanbley's face was drawn with pain, his movements stiff and careful. But his eyes were clear and determined, fixed on the distant plume of smoke rising from the direction of Montgomery's camp. "They're starting early," Sarah observed, adjusting the rifle slung across her back. "We need to move fast." Wanbley nodded grimly. "2 battles today, your farm and my village. Montgomery will attack both." The realization had come to them during the night. With the alliance broken and Michael's maps in his possession, Montgomery would waste no time. He would strike simultaneously at both threats to his plans, overwhelming them before they could reunite. "You think 40 men?" Sarah asked, recalling their earlier estimate of Montgomery's forces. "At least," Wanbley confirmed. "Van Cleef gang and hired guns from railroad." Their plan was desperate but simple. Sarah would head to Fort Creek to find Daniel Peterson, the only person in town she still trusted. If Montgomery was planning to attack today, there might still be evidence at his office, perhaps even information about where Mina was being held. Meanwhile, Wanbley would return to the Lakota village to warn Dakota, hoping his testimony would be enough to convince the chief of Jenkins' deception. "Be careful," Sarah said as they prepared to part ways at the base of the ridge. "If Dakota won't listen—" "He will listen," Wanbley interrupted with quiet confidence. "Blood speaks truth even when ears doubt." The statement was so quintessentially Lakota that Sarah found herself smiling despite the gravity of their situation. "Then I'll see you by the North Bend at midday as planned." Wanbley held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, something unspoken passing between them. Then he turned and melted into the trees, moving with the silent grace of a man born to the wilderness. Sarah watched him go, then mounted her horse and set off for Fort Creek, keeping to the lesser-known trails that Michael had shown her years ago. The town was just waking up when she arrived, tying her horse behind the general store, rather than at the main hitching post where she might be noticed. The back door was unlocked just as Daniel had promised it would be if she ever needed to enter discreetly. The store was quiet, the front still shuttered against the early morning light. Sarah moved carefully through the storeroom, alert for any sound that might indicate Daniel wasn't alone. "Daniel," she called softly. A rustling from the front of the store was followed by hurried footsteps. Daniel appeared in the doorway, his normally neat appearance disheveled, as if he hadn't slept. "Sarah," he exclaimed in a harsh whisper, "thank God you're safe. I've been worried sick." "What's happened?" Sarah asked immediately, sensing something was wrong. Daniel glanced nervously over his shoulder. "Montgomery's men were in town yesterday, dozens of them, armed to the teeth. They've taken over the saloon, the hotel, even the sheriff's office." Wilkins let them. Wilkins had no choice, Daniel replied. Or so he claims. But between you and me, I think he's been in Montgomery's pocket all along. Sarah wasn't surprised. I need information, Daniel. Montgomery's planning something big today, an attack on my farm and the Lakota village. Do you know anything about it? Daniel hesitated, then motioned for her to follow him to the front of the store. After confirming the street outside was empty, he pulled a folded paper from beneath the counter. One of Montgomery's men left this behind last night. Drunk, I think. I found it when I was cleaning up. Sarah unfolded the paper to find a rough map of the valley with markings at several points along the creek, including her farm and the approach to the Lakota village. Times were scrawled in the margins, 10 a.m. for the farm, noon for the village. He's coordinating the attacks, she murmured, drawing out the defenders at my farm first, then hitting the village when they're already engaged. There's more, Daniel said, his voice dropping even lower. They've got a girl, native, keeping her at the old Wilkinson place just outside town. Sarah's heart quickened. Wanblee's sister, is she all right? Seems to be. I delivered supplies there yesterday on Montgomery's orders. Saw her through the window. She's guarded but not mistreated from what I could tell. Relief washed through Sarah. At least Mina was alive and relatively safe. I need to get her out, Daniel, and I need to warn the Lakota about the attack. Daniel's expression grew grave. You can't do both, Sarah. Not in time. I know. Sarah studied the map again, mind racing. But maybe we can. She looked up at him. I need your help, Daniel. Real help, not just information. The storekeeper straightened a determination she hadn't seen before, hardening his normally gentle features. Whatever you need. Take this map to the Lakota village, Sarah instructed. Ask for Chief Dakota. Tell him Montgomery's men are coming at noon and that I've gone to free Wanblee's sister. Tell him Jenkins is a spy and that everything he said about me was a lie. Daniel swallowed hard. The Lakota don't exactly welcome white men these days, Sarah. Tell them you come in Michael Blackwood's name, Sarah said, and take this. She removed the turquoise pendant Michael had given her years ago, a token of respect he'd received from Dakota. They'll know what it means. Some. Daniel took the pendant, his hands trembling slightly. And what will you do? Free Mina, Sarah replied simply. Then try to slow Montgomery's men at my farm until the Lakota can prepare their defenses. That's suicide, Sarah. You can't stand against 40 armed men alone. I won't be alone for long, she said with more confidence than she felt. Not if Wanblee convinces Dakota. Daniel studied her face, then nodded reluctantly. All right, but take these first. He disappeared into the storeroom, returning moments later with a box of ammunition for her rifle and a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Dynamite, he explained at her questioning look. Left over from when they were blasting for the railroad last year. Not much, but it might buy you some time. Sarah accepted both with a grateful nod. Be careful, Daniel. If you're caught with that map, I won't be, he promised. I know these back roads better than Montgomery's men ever could. As they parted at the rear door, Daniel hesitated. Sarah, what are we really fighting for here? Is it just about your farm and the Lakota land? Sarah thought of Michael's vision for the Valley of the Water flowing freely for all who needed it, of the future that might be built if Montgomery's greed could be stopped. It's about more than land, she said finally. It's about the kind of people we choose to be, the kind of future we're willing to fight for. Daniel nodded, a new understanding in his eyes. Then Godspeed, Sarah Blackwood. I'll see you when this is over. With that, they went their separate ways, Daniel heading north toward the Lakota village, Sarah east toward the Wilkinson place, where Mina was being held. The Wilkinson homestead had been abandoned for nearly 5 years, ever since Old Man Wilkinson lost his wife to pneumonia and moved back east to live with his daughter. The small cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by pine trees, a weathered but solid structure that had withstood the Dakota winters through careful construction. Now it served as a prison for Wanblee's sister. Sarah approached cautiously, leaving her horse tethered in the trees a quarter-mile away. She circled the property slowly, keeping to the cover of the forest as she assessed the situation. 2 men stood on the porch, rifles visible, sharing a smoke and conversing in low voices. Another man was visible through the front window, seated at a table inside. 3 guards for 1 girl. Montgomery was taking no chances. The direct approach would be suicide. Sarah needed a distraction, something to draw at least some of the guards away from the cabin. Her hand went to the package of dynamite Daniel had given her. A small charge set off in the trees away from the cabin might do the trick. She was about to withdraw when the cabin door opened and a young Lakota woman stepped onto the porch flanked by one of the guards. Mina was perhaps 17 or 18 with the same proud bearing as her brother, despite her captivity. She showed no fear as she faced the morning sun, her expression serene but resolute. "Back inside, girl," one of the men ordered gruffly. "You've had your air." Mina turned to him saying something too quiet for Sarah to hear, but the man's response was clear enough. "You'll go when Montgomery says you can go, not before. Your brother knows the deal." Sarah's jaw tightened. She needed to move quickly before the men moved Mina, or worse, decided she was no longer useful as a hostage. Retreating deeper into the trees, she worked her way around to the east side of the clearing, where a small stream provided cover with its gentle burbling. There she carefully prepared a small charge of dynamite, using the longest fuse Daniel had provided. The explosion when it came was more effective than she had hoped. The blast echoed through the trees, sending birds scattering into the sky. From her new position near the back of the cabin, Sarah watched as 2 of the guards immediately grabbed their rifles and hurried toward the sound, leaving only 1 man with Mina inside. Sarah moved swiftly, now approaching the cabin from the blind side. The remaining guard would be alert, but his attention would be divided between watching Mina and waiting for his companions to return. She needed to act before they discovered the false alarm. The back door was locked, but the window beside it was slightly open to catch the morning breeze. Sarah listened carefully, hearing movement inside a chair, scraping footsteps crossing the wooden floor. "Your friends might be walking into a trap." Mina's voice came clearly through the window, remarkably composed. "Shut up," the guard replied. "Probably just a deer triggered a trap. My people are coming for me." Mina continued, undeterred. "The white woman too, the one whose land you seek to steal." "That white woman's probably dead by now," the guard said with a cruel laugh. "Your brother too, if he was stupid enough to side with her." Sarah had heard enough. She slipped the hunting knife from her belt and eased the window open wider, thanking Providence that the old hinges didn't squeak. With a silent prayer, she pulled herself up and through the opening in one fluid motion. The guard had his back to her, attention focused on Mina, who sat at the table, hands bound before her. The young woman's eyes widened slightly at the sight of Sarah, but she gave no other indication of surprise, a presence of mind that spoke volumes about her character. Sarah crossed the room in 3 quick strides, bringing the hilt of her knife down hard on the back of the guard's head. He crumpled without a sound. "Mrs. Blackwood," Mina said as Sarah quickly cut her bonds. "My brother sent you." "In a manner of speaking," Sarah replied, already moving toward the front window to check for the returning guards. "Wombley's gone to warn your village. Montgomery's planning an attack at noon." Understanding dawned in Mina's eyes. "That's why they've kept me alive. To distract him." "Exactly. We need to move quickly." But they were already too late. Through the window, Sarah could see the other 2 guards returning, alerted either by instinct or some sound from within the cabin. Their expressions shifted from confusion to alarm as they realized something was wrong. "Out the back," Sarah ordered, grabbing her rifle. "Head for the trees. I'll cover you." Mina didn't argue, slipping out the back window with the grace of someone used to moving quickly and quietly through difficult terrain. Sarah positioned herself by the front door, rifle ready. As soon as she heard Mina clear the window, she fired 2 shots through the front wall of the cabin, not aiming to hit the men, but to force them to take cover and buy Mina more time to escape. The guards returned fire immediately, bullets splintering the wooden walls of the cabin. Sarah waited for a pause in their shooting, then darted for the back window herself. She was halfway through when a searing pain tore through her left arm. One of the guards had circled around, catching her as she escaped. Gritting her teeth against the pain, Sarah tumbled through the window and rolled to her feet, spotting Mina waiting at the edge of the trees. The girl's expression changed to alarm at the sight of the blood soaking Sarah's sleeve. "Go!" Sarah urged, pushing herself forward despite the wound. "Keep going!" They ran together into the forest, the sound of pursuit close behind them. Sarah's vision swam with each jarring step, the blood loss already taking its toll. But they couldn't stop, not with Montgomery's men behind them and the attack on the farm ahead. "This way," Mina said suddenly, veering off the path onto an almost invisible game trail. Water will hide our trail. She led them to a shallow stream that cut through the forest, then downstream for several hundred yards before emerging in a small clearing, where to Sarah's astonishment, two horses waited, one of them, Sarah's own mount, that she had left tethered far from the cabin. "How did you—" "I found him while waiting for you," Mina explained, already helping Sarah mount despite her injury. "My brother taught me to track." The pride in her voice reminded Sarah so much of Juan Blee that she couldn't help but smile through her pain. "Your brother would be proud." Mina mounted the second horse, presumably belonging to one of the guards, with practiced ease. "Where now? The village?" Sarah shook her head. "My farm first. Montgomery's men will be there by now. We need to slow them down, give Daniel time to reach your people with the warning." "You're wounded," Mina pointed out. "You need medicine." "Later," Sarah said firmly. "Right now we need to ride." The sight that greeted them as they approached Black Creek Farm turned Sarah's blood cold. Smoke rose from the direction of the barn, and the distant crack of gunfire echoed across the valley. Montgomery's attack had already begun. They reined in their horses on a ridge overlooking the farm, using a stand of cottonwoods for cover as they assessed the situation. What Sarah saw made her breath catch in her throat. The farmhouse was under siege, surrounded by at least 20 armed men who were firing regularly at the structure. But incredibly, someone was returning fire from within accurate measured shots that had already left 3 attackers lying motionless on the ground. "Juan Blee," Mina breathed, recognizing her brother's marksmanship. Sarah felt a surge of confused hope. Juan Blee was supposed to be warning the village, not defending her farm. Had something gone wrong, or had he somehow managed to do both? Her questions were answered a moment later, when a war cry rose from the northern edge of the property. A group of Lakota warriors, perhaps 15 strong, charged from the tree line on horseback, led by the unmistakable figure of Chief Dakota himself. They fell upon Montgomery's men from behind, the surprise of their attack creating momentary chaos. "They came," Sarah whispered, relief washing through her. Dakota believed him. Taking advantage of the confusion, Sarah and Mina rode hard for the farmhouse, keeping to the cover of the irrigation ditches where possible. They reached the back door just as Juan Blee emerged to provide covering fire, his face lighting with joy and disbelief at the sight of his sister. "Mina!" he exclaimed, pulling her into a quick, fierce embrace before helping Sarah dismount. His expression darkened at the sight of her wound. Inside quickly. The interior of the farmhouse had been transformed into a makeshift fortress. Furniture was pushed against windows, leaving only narrow gaps for firing. Water barrels had been positioned strategically in case of fire. And to Sarah's surprise, Daniel Peterson sat at her kitchen table, calmly loading rifles. "Daniel," she exclaimed, "how did you—" "Got to the village just as Juan Blee arrived," Daniel explained, handing a loaded rifle to Mina without hesitation. Dakota had already changed his mind after hearing Juan Blee's story. "Your pendant just confirmed it." He nodded to Juan Blee. "His idea to split forces, half to defend here, half to prepare the village. Montgomery's men are at both places now," Juan Blee said grimly, examining Sarah's wound. "Bullet went through clean. Need to bind it." As he worked to dress her injury, Sarah listened to the battle raging outside. The initial advantage of surprise had faded, and Montgomery's men were regrouping, their superior numbers beginning to tell despite the Lakota's fierce fighting. "Van Cleef is leading them," Juan Blee informed her as he tied off the bandage. "Montgomery is not here. Still at town directing other attack." "What about Jenkins?" Sarah asked, wincing as she tested her arm. "Dead," Juan Blee replied flatly. "Tried to warn Montgomery's men at village. 2 hawks caught him." The fighting outside intensified. Through the window, Sarah could see that the Lakota warriors were now engaged in close combat with Montgomery's men around the barn. But the attackers near the house had used the distraction to move closer, and soon the walls were being peppered with bullets once more. "We can't hold them off much longer," Daniel said, his earlier calm giving way to concern. "There are too many." Sarah's mind raced. They had slowed Montgomery's attack, but not stopped it. And if his men overran the farm, they would move on to the village next, where the remaining Lakota would be hard-pressed to defend themselves, especially if Montgomery had another force attacking from a different direction. Her gaze fell on the map of the valley still spread on the table, and specifically on the marking indicating the emergency valve Michael had built into his irrigation system, the one Juan Blee had saved from Jenkins and his men. The valve, she said suddenly. We can flood the lower valley. Wanblee followed her gaze to the map. Would wash away Montgomery's men, but also much of your farm. And give the village time to evacuate if necessary, Sarah added. It's our only chance. The decision made, they quickly formulated a plan. Daniel would create a diversion at the front of the house, drawing attention away from the back. Meanwhile, Sarah, Wanblee, and Mina would make for the ridge where the valve mechanism was hidden, using the irrigation ditches for cover where possible. If we don't make it back, Sarah told Daniel, gripping his hand, get word to Federal Marshal Reynolds. Tell him everything that happened here. Daniel nodded solemnly. God go with you, Sarah. Watch for etched. The diversion, when it came, was more effective than any of them could have hoped. Daniel had combined the remaining dynamite with kerosene from the lamps, creating an explosion at the front of the house that sent Montgomery's men scrambling for cover. In the confusion, Sarah and the others slipped out the back door and into the nearest irrigation ditch, using its depth to shield them from view as they made their way toward the ridge. The valve mechanism was located in a small stone structure built into the side of the ridge, designed to look like nothing more than a natural outcropping to the untrained eye. Michael had shown it to Sarah only once, explaining that it should never be used except in the most dire emergency. It will release the pressure from the underground spring, he had told her. The water will find its natural path right through the heart of the lower valley. Now, as they reached the hidden door, Sarah's hands trembled slightly at the enormity of what they were about to do. Opening the valve would save them from Montgomery's men, but at the cost of much of the farm she had fought so hard to protect. Wanblee seemed to sense her hesitation. Water can destroy, he said quietly, but also cleanse, make new growth possible. Sarah nodded, finding strength in his words. Together, they pulled open the heavy stone door, revealing the valve mechanism within a complex arrangement of gears and levers that Michael had designed with his engineer's precision. 2 people needed, Wanblee observed, studying the mechanism. 1 to remove safety pin 1 to turn main wheel. I'll remove the pin, Sarah said, already reaching for the metal rod that locked the system in place. Mina, keep watch. The safety pin required both strength and precision to withdraw Michael's intentional design to prevent accidental triggering. Sarah's wounded arm screamed in protest as she twisted and pulled, but finally the pin came free with a metallic groan. Now, she called to Wanblee, who immediately began to turn the massive wheel that controlled the valve. It moved slowly at first, resisting after years of disuse. Then suddenly it gave way, spinning faster as the pressure of the trapped water took over. A deep rumbling sound emanated from beneath their feet, growing in intensity until the very ground seemed to vibrate with its force. It's working, Sarah breathed, stepping back from the mechanism. We need to get to higher ground, now. They emerged from the stone structure to find Mina signaling urgently from her lookout position. Riders coming, Van Cleef himself. Sure enough, 5 horsemen were galloping toward the ridge, led by the distinctive figure of Jackson Van Cleef. They had been spotted. Go, Wanblee urged the women. Up ridge, I will slow them. We're not leaving you, Sarah insisted, raising her rifle despite her injured arm. The first shots came before Wanblee could argue further, forcing them to take cover behind the rocks. Van Cleef and his men were closing quickly, spreading out to surround the ridge. The rumbling beneath them intensified, and somewhere in the distance came the sound of rushing water, the underground spring finding its new path toward the valley floor. Soon the lower fields would be flooded, washing away Montgomery's men, still attacking the farmhouse. But if they couldn't hold off Van Cleef long enough to reach the safety of the higher ridge, they would be caught in the flood themselves or gunned down where they stood. Wanblee fired methodically, his aim true despite the pressure. 2 of Van Cleef's men fell from their horses, but the remaining 3, including Van Cleef himself, kept coming. Sarah joined the defense, ignoring the pain that threatened to make her vision swim with each shot. Mina, armed with only a knife, watched for any attempt to flank their position. The water was visible now, a torrent bursting from multiple points along the lower ridge, converging into a powerful flow that swept toward the farm below. Montgomery's men, suddenly aware of the new threat, were abandoning their attack on the farmhouse, scrambling for higher ground. Some made it, many did not. Van Cleef, seeing the destruction unfolding below, pulled his horse to a halt just out of effective rifle range. For a long moment he sat watching as the water claimed the valley floor, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. Then, to Sarah's astonishment, he turned his horse and rode away, his remaining men following after a moment's hesitation. "He's retreating," Mina asked incredulously. "No!" Wanblee said, his eyes narrowing. "Changing targets. Going to village." The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. With the farm effectively neutralized by the flood, Van Cleef would join the attack on the Lakota village, potentially overwhelming the defenders there. "We have to warn them," she said, already moving toward where they had left their horses. "If we ride hard along the high ridge, we might get there ahead of Van Cleef." But fate had one more card to play. As they crested the ridge, a new sound reached them, hoofbeats, many of them approaching from the east. Sarah raised her field glasses, expecting to see more of Montgomery's men. Instead, what she saw made her heart leap. Riding hard toward the valley was a column of uniformed men, U.S. cavalry, at least 30 strong. And at their head, the tall figure of Federal Marshal Reynolds, whom Sarah had last seen 5 years ago, when he'd passed through Fort Creek on official business. "The cavalry," she said, lowering the glasses with shaking hands. "Daniel must have sent word somehow." "Erin, will they help us?" Wanblee asked skeptically, "or finish what Montgomery started?" It was a fair question. The U.S. government had rarely been a friend to the Lakota, or any native tribe, but Sarah remembered Reynolds as a fair man, one who had once owed Michael a debt for engineering work that had saved a frontier fort from flooding. "We have to try," she decided. "It's our best chance to save the village." They rode to intercept the cavalry column, Sarah's wounded arm now throbbing relentlessly with each hoofbeat. Reynolds recognized her, immediately ordering his men to halt as she approached. "Mrs. Blackwood," he greeted her with a tip of his hat. "It seems we've arrived in the midst of some excitement." "Marshal Reynolds," Sarah acknowledged, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Chester Montgomery's men are attacking the Lakota village north of here. They've already tried to take my farm." Reynolds's expression grew serious. So Peterson's message was accurate. "He reached us yesterday at Fort Berthold, half dead from riding so hard." His gaze took in her bloody sleeve, Wanblee's battered face, and the floodwaters still rising in the valley below. "Appears we have quite a situation on our hands." "Montgomery wants the gold beneath the creek bed," Sarah explained rapidly. "He's trying to drive us both off our land so he can divert the water and mine it. His men are led by Jackson Van Cleef." At the mention of Van Cleef, Reynolds' face darkened. "Van Cleef has a federal warrant out for his arrest. Murdered 3 settlers up near Bismarck last month." He turned to his lieutenant. "Prepare the men to ride. We're heading for the Lakota village." "You're going to help them?" Sarah asked, hardly daring to believe it. Reynolds met her gaze steadily. "I'm going to uphold the law, Mrs. Blackwood. Something that's been in short supply in these parts from what Peterson tells me." He glanced at Wanblee and Mina. "If Montgomery's men are attacking a peaceful settlement without provocation, they're the criminals, regardless of who they're attacking." Relief washed through Sarah, so profound it almost made her sway in the saddle. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Reynolds warned. "We've still got a battle to stop." He signaled to his men. "Move out." As the cavalry column thundered toward the Lakota village, Sarah found herself riding alongside Reynolds at the head of the formation, with Wanblee and Mina close behind. The marshal glanced at her with grudging respect. "Your husband would be proud," he said. "Michael always said you had more backbone than most men he knew." Sarah thought of Michael, of the vision he'd had for the valley, of the partnerships he'd tried to build between peoples who had been taught to fear and hate one another. "I'm just trying to protect what he built," she replied. "What we all need to survive." Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. "Water and peace. Seems like those things should be simple enough." They crested the final ridge overlooking the Lakota village, just as Van Cleef and his remaining men joined the attack already in progress. The scene below was chaos. Montgomery's forces had pushed into the village itself, setting fire to one of the sacred lodges. The Lakota defenders were fighting valiantly, but were clearly outnumbered. "Buglers, sound the charge," Reynolds ordered. "Lieutenant, take the left flank. We'll drive them toward the creek." The bugle call split the air, causing Montgomery's men to look up in confusion and alarm. The sight of U.S. cavalry charging down upon them, not as allies but as enemies, created instant disarray in their ranks. Some threw down their weapons immediately, while others scrambled for their horses. Van Cleef, however, seemed to have been expecting this moment. Instead of fleeing with his men, he turned his horse directly toward the ridge where Sarah and the others had paused to survey the battle. His eyes locked with Sarah's across the distance, a strange mix of resignation and defiance in his weathered face. "He's coming for us," Wombly said quietly, raising his rifle. "No," Sarah responded, placing her hand on the barrel. "He's coming for me." Van Cleef rode steadily up the slope, making no attempt to draw his weapon, even as the battle behind him turned decisively against Montgomery's forces. When he was within 20 paces, he reined in his horse and removed his hat in a gesture that might have been respect or might have been surrender. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that had fallen over their small group. "Seems like the game is up." "This was never a game, Mr. Van Cleef," Sarah replied. "People have died. Homes have been destroyed." Van Cleef nodded, showing no sign of remorse, but perhaps a hint of weariness. "Your husband once pulled me from a river during the war," he said, the non sequitur taking Sarah by surprise. "Enemy soldier half drowned, and he risked his life to save mine. Never understood why." Sarah remembered Michael telling the story, a Confederate officer swept away during a failed river crossing, rescued on impulse despite the danger. "He believed every life had value," she said simply, "even his enemies." A ghost of a smile touched Van Cleef's lips. "Man like that deserved better than to die of consumption in a frontier shack." He glanced at the cavalry now rounding up the last of Montgomery's men in the village below. "And you deserve better than to have to fight his battles after he was gone." Before Sarah could respond, Van Cleef reached slowly into his coat. Wombly tensed beside her, but the outlaw withdrew only a folded document, which he extended toward Sarah. "Montgomery's confession," he explained. "Signed and witnessed. Details of the bribes to Sheriff Wilkins, the plans to illegally divert the creek, everything. Enough to put him away for a long time." Sarah took the paper with her good hand, confusion evident on her face. "Why would you give me this?" Van Cleef's gaze drifted to the distant mountains, a hint of something like regret in his eyes. "Maybe your husband's foolish mercy deserves better repayment than what I've given so far." He looked back at her. "Or maybe I'm just tired of working for men like Montgomery who hide behind money and power while others do their dirty work." He turned his horse preparing to ride, but Sarah called after him. "The law will find you, Mr. Van Cleef. Reynolds won't stop looking." Van Cleef paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Perhaps, but the law is slow and the frontier is vast." His eyes moved to Wanblee, then to the Lakota village below. "Tell Dakota I regret the harm done to his people. Some debts can't be repaid, but they should at least be acknowledged." With that, he spurred his horse and rode away, not toward escape, but down toward the village where Marshal Reynolds and his men were restoring order. Sarah watched in astonishment as Van Cleef rode directly to Reynolds, said something brief, then handed over his weapons and held out his wrist for the manacles that would bind him. "He surrendered," Mina murmured in disbelief. Noma Wombly corrected, a new understanding in his voice. "He chose his path, his ending." Sarah nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the document in her hand, the key to ending Montgomery's threat once and for all. As they rode down to join Reynolds and the others, she thought again of Michael's words about the water, that it belonged to no one and everyone, that it should flow freely for all who needed it. In opening the valve, she had destroyed much of what she had fought to protect. The lower fields of her farm now lay beneath several feet of water, the carefully engineered irrigation channels washed away. But as she surveyed the damage, Sarah realized that what mattered most remained the land itself, the people who depended on it, and the possibility of building something new and perhaps better from the ruins of the old. The aftermath unfolded over days and weeks, each bringing its own measure of loss and renewal. Montgomery was arrested in Fort Creek, his empire crumbling as news of his crimes spread. Sheriff Wilkins was removed from office, replaced temporarily by one of Reynolds' deputies until elections could be held. Daniel Peterson, recovering from the wounds he'd sustained during his desperate ride to find help, was being mentioned as a possible candidate. Reynolds, true to his word, had treated the Lakota with unexpected respect and fairness. More surprisingly, he had recommended to his superiors that the U.S. government formally recognize the waters of Black Creek as shared resource between Sarah's farm and the Lakota, lands, a first-of-its-kind agreement that acknowledged both parties' legitimate claims to the life-giving flow. Sarah stood on the porch of her rebuilt farmhouse, watching as Wanblee directed a mixed group of workers, some Lakota, some white settlers who had chosen to side with her against Montgomery in the construction of a new irrigation system. This one was designed collaboratively, incorporating both Michael's engineering principles and traditional Lakota water management techniques that had served them for generations. Chief Lakota approached his dignity undiminished despite the bandages still visible beneath his clothing wounds, sustained defending his village. "The water flows again," he observed, gesturing to the newly channeled creek that now split more evenly between their lands. "Different path, but same purpose. Life finds a way." Sarah agreed, the words carrying deeper meaning than just the water's flow. "Even after destruction." Lakota nodded, a rare smile softening his features. "My people have a saying, the greatest strength is not in never falling, but in rising after the fall." They stood in companionable silence, watching as Wanblee, now recognized as Lakota's successor, since the chief had announced his intention to step down, demonstrated a technique for securing the wooden gates that would control the water's flow during spring floods. His leadership had been earned not just through birth, but through action. His choices during the conflict with Montgomery, revealing a wisdom beyond his years. As if sensing their gaze, Wanblee looked up and raised a hand in greeting. Sarah returned the gesture, feeling a complicated warmth that had grown between them during the weeks of rebuilding. Not romance, perhaps, but something equally profound, a connection forged in shared struggle and mutual respect. "He will be a good chief," Lakota said, following her gaze. "For new times." "And you?" Sarah asked. "What will you do now?" Lakota's eyes drifted to the distant mountains. "Listen to the ancestors. Tell stories to the children. Remember what was so they can build what will be." In the valley below, the creek caught the late afternoon light, sparkling like scattered gems as it wound its way between Sarah's fields and the Lakota lands. No longer separated by the water, but united by it, two worlds meeting at a shared boundary that nourished both. Near the rebuilt barn, Sarah could see Van Cleef's grave, a simple marker beside a young cottonwood tree. The outlaw had succumbed to his wounds 3 days after his surrender, requesting with his last breath to be buried near the creek he had helped to save in the end. A complicated man, neither hero nor villain, but somewhere in between, like most people when one looked closely enough. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Sarah thought of all they had lost and all they had gained. Montgomery's greed had nearly destroyed 2 communities, but in fighting him, they had created something new, an alliance that might, with care and wisdom, grow into a genuine friendship. The water that flowed between their lands was no longer just a resource to be controlled, but a symbol of what could be built when people chose cooperation over conflict. "It will not be easy," Lakota said, as if reading her thoughts. "Old hatreds run deep like underground streams." "But so does hope," Sarah replied. "And sometimes it just takes one spring to change the course of the river." Lakota considered this, then nodded slowly. "Your husband would be proud of what you have built from his dream." "What we have built," Sarah corrected gently, "all of us together." As darkness fell over Black Creek Valley, lights began to glow in both the farmhouse and the Lakota village beyond, pinpoints of warmth in the gathering night. Between them flowed the water, its soft murmur, a constant reminder of what they had fought for, and what they continued to build, not just 2 separate communities existing side by side, but a shared future crafted from the best of both worlds. And in that twilight moment, watching the creek wind its silver path through the valley her husband had loved, Sarah Blackwood felt at last the weight of her grief begin to lift, not vanishing entirely, but transforming into something else, something that could nourish new growth in the seasons to come. Like the water itself, always in motion, always changing, always finding its way forward into the unknown. "I have told the council of our alliance," Lakota began once they were settled. "Many are skeptical." "That's understandable," Sarah acknowledged. "My people haven't given yours much reason to trust us." One of the older men spoke sharply in Lakota, his weathered face creased with suspicion as he gestured toward Sarah. "Running Bear asks why we should believe you are different," Lakota translated. "Why your water is more important than the many promises the white man has broken?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. "I don't ask you to trust all white people or even to trust me completely. I ask only that you judge me by my actions, not just my skin." She looked around the circle, meeting each gaze directly. Montgomery threatens both our lands. Together we have a better chance of stopping him than either of us does alone. After Dakota translated, a tense silence filled the lodge. Finally, one of the women, gray-haired but sitting straight-backed and proud, spoke in measured tones. My sister Singing Bird says your husband was different, Dakota related. He respected our ways, learned our language. He helped build the channels that bring water to our sacred pools. If you are truly his wife in spirit as well as name, perhaps you can be trusted. Michael believed that the water belonged to the land, not to any one people, Sarah replied. I share that belief. The discussion continued for over an hour, moving between English and Lakota, as the council debated the wisdom of allying with a white woman against a white man. Sarah remained patient throughout, answering questions directly and without defensiveness. She spoke of Montgomery's plans to divert the creek, the gold he sought beneath it, and the devastation it would bring to both their communities. Gradually, the mood in the lodge shifted, not to wholehearted acceptance perhaps, but to a grudging acknowledgement that their interests might truly align in this matter. We will help you watch for Montgomery's men. Dakota finally declared, the decision apparently reached. Our warriors will patrol the boundaries where our lands meet. If they see anything suspicious, they will alert you. And I will continue to maintain what remains of the irrigation system, Sarah promised, to ensure the water flows as it should to your lands as well as mine. As the council dispersed, Dakota asked Sarah to remain behind. Once they were alone, save for Wanblee, who stood nearby, the chief's formal demeanor softened slightly. You spoke well, he told her, but words are wind. Montgomery will test our resolve with fire. I know, Sarah replied. That's why I brought this. She reached into her saddlebag and withdrew a rolled parchment, spreading it carefully on the ground between them. It was a detailed map of the valley drawn in Michael's precise hand, showing not just the visible waterways but the underground springs and channels he had discovered during his work. Michael mapped everything, she explained, tracing the intricate lines with her finger. He believed in understanding the land completely before working with it. These marks here, she pointed to several points along the creek, show where the water runs through narrow underground passages, vulnerable points. Dakota studied the map with evident interest. If Montgomery wishes to divert the creek, these would be the places he'd target, Sarah confirmed. We should watch them most carefully. The chief nodded slowly. You trust us with this knowledge? We're allies now, Sarah said simply. The water's fate affects us both. Dakota regarded her thoughtfully. Perhaps Michael Blackwood's spirit lives on in more than just his maps and waterways. He rolled up the parchment and handed it back to her. Keep this safe. Knowledge like water has power in the right hands and danger in the wrong ones. As Sarah prepared to leave, Wanblee approached her, his expression unusually hesitant. I will stay here tonight, he said, to recover fully. Then I return to help guard your land. Sarah nodded, understanding the unspoken message. He needed time with his people to reassure them of his loyalty, despite his growing alliance with her. Thank you, Wanblee, she said, for everything. The ride back to her farm was solitary but not lonely. Sarah felt a cautious optimism taking root alongside her determination. The alliance with the Lakota was fragile, built on shared danger rather than shared trust, but it was a beginning. Together, perhaps, they could stand against whatever Montgomery planned next. She was so absorbed in these thoughts that she almost missed the figure waiting on her porch, a stranger dressed in the practical clothes of a working farmer, but with a clean-shaven face and uncalloused hands that marked him as something else entirely. Mrs. Blackwood, he called as she approached, his smile warm and open. Hope you don't mind me waiting. Name's Thomas Jenkins. Just moved into the old Miller place down the road. Sarah reined in her horse, maintaining a cautious distance. New neighbors were rare in these parts, especially ones who appeared without warning. Mr. Jenkins, she acknowledged with a nod. What brings you to my door? Neighborly courtesy, ma'am. Thought I should introduce myself. His smile widened. And to be honest, I could use some advice. Heard you know this land better than most. Sarah dismounted slowly, her hand never straying far from the rifle secured to her saddle. The Miller place has been abandoned for years. What made you decide to settle there? Jenkins shrugged, his manner easy and disarming. Looking for a fresh start. War left me with a taste for open spaces and peace and quiet. He gestured at his left leg, which Sarah now noticed carried a slight limp. Took some Confederate lead at Antietam. Doctors said I'd never walk right again, but here I am. The mention of the war softened Sarah's suspicion somewhat. Many veterans had come west seeking new beginnings. Well, Mr. Jenkins, I'm afraid I don't have much time for social calls these days. There's been some trouble with my irrigation system that needs tending. So I heard, Jenkins replied, his expression growing serious. Word in town is that Montgomery's men blew up your dam. Terrible business. He shook his head. Man like that thinks he can buy or bully his way to whatever he wants. The apparent sympathy gave Sarah pause. Few in Fort Creek had openly taken her side against Montgomery. You seem well informed for someone who just arrived, she observed. Jenkins laughed softly. Small towns, Mrs. Blackwood. Everyone talks, especially when a pretty widow stands up to the richest man around. He tipped his hat. I won't keep you from your work. Just wanted to say that if you need an extra pair of hands with those repairs, I'm happy to help. Learned a thing or two about construction during the war. I'll keep that in mind, Sarah replied, still uncertain what to make of him. As Jenkins turned to leave, he paused. One more thing, ma'am. Been meaning to ask. I noticed some Indians crossing near my property yesterday. Lakota by the look of them. Should I be concerned? The casual question sent a chill through Sarah. The Lakota patrols had only been agreed upon that morning, and they wouldn't have crossed anywhere near the Miller property. The Lakota keep to themselves mostly, she said carefully. As long as you do the same, there shouldn't be any trouble. Jenkins nodded. Good to know. Well, good day to you, Mrs. Blackwood. Hope to see you again soon. Sarah watched him walk away, his slight limp somehow less pronounced than it had been earlier. Only when he was out of sight did she enter her house, mind racing with suspicion and possibilities. The next 2 weeks established a tentative rhythm. Sarah worked to repair the dam, while Lakota warriors patrolled the boundaries between their lands. Wanbley divided his time between the village and Sarah's farm, serving as a bridge between the two allies. And Thomas Jenkins made himself increasingly present in the valley, always friendly, always helpful, always watching. Sarah's suspicions about the new neighbor grew daily. The questions he asked seemed innocuous on the surface, about the land, the water, the Lakota, but carried an undercurrent of probing curiosity that set her on edge. More concerning were the accidental meetings with Lakota patrols that Jenkins reported with growing frequency, always expressing mild concern about their presence so close to settled lands. I'm telling you, there's something not right about him, Sarah told Wanbley as they worked together to reinforce a section of the irrigation channel. He asked too many questions about the Lakota, about you specifically. Wanbley nodded grimly. 2 nights ago, I saw him following 2 hawks on patrol, hiding, watching. We need to warn Dakota, Sarah said. I think Jenkins is working for Montgomery, spying on us, trying to find weaknesses in our alliance. Or worse, Wanbley replied, creating weakness. The truth of his words became apparent that very evening when a young Lakota warrior named Running Fox arrived at Sarah's door, his expression thunderous. You betray us, he accused without preamble. Give maps of our sacred land to soldiers. Sarah stared at him in confusion. What are you talking about? I've given no maps to anyone. White farmer says you meet with Army officer, Running Fox continued. Give him maps showing our village, our sacred pools. Say soldiers come soon to force us from land. The pieces clicked into place in Sarah's mind. Jenkins, she breathed. He's lying to you. Running Fox's eyes narrowed. He shows us paper with your writing, military plans. It's a forgery, Sarah insisted. I would never do that. The alliance between us is sincere. The young warrior's face remained skeptical. Dakota wants proof, wants to see you tomorrow at dawn. After Running Fox departed, Sarah paced her kitchen, mind racing. Jenkins had clearly fabricated evidence to drive a wedge between her and the Lakota. But why? What did Montgomery hope to gain by turning them against each other? The answer came to her as she lay sleepless in bed. Divided, they were vulnerable. If the Lakota believed she had betrayed them, they would withdraw their patrols, leaving the creek's vulnerable points unguarded. Meanwhile, if she was busy defending herself against their accusations, She wouldn't be watching for Montgomery's next move. When dawn painted the eastern sky with pale light, Sarah was already mounted and riding toward the meeting place, determined to unmask Jenkins' deception. But as she crested the ridge overlooking the stone formation, her heart sank. Dakota waited with several warriors, and beside them stood Thomas Jenkins, his expression grave. Sarah approached slowly, acutely aware of the hostile stares directed her way. Dakota's face was unreadable, but the rigidity of his posture spoke volumes. "Chief Dakota," she greeted him, ignoring Jenkins completely. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding." "Is that what you call betrayal?" one of the warriors demanded in accented English. "Misunderstanding." Dakota held up a hand, silencing him. "Mr. Jenkins has brought concerning information to our attention." He gestured to the man. "He says you have been meeting with military officials, providing them with maps of our lands." "That's a lie," Sarah stated flatly. She turned to Jenkins. "You've been working for Montgomery all along, haven't you? Trying to break our alliance because he knows together we're stronger than either of us alone?" Jenkins' expression remained innocently concerned. "Mrs. Blackwood, I understand you're upset, but I saw what I saw. You and that officer examining maps together on your porch 3 nights ago." "I was at home alone 3 nights ago," Sarah countered, "as I am every night." "I have no reason to lie," Jenkins said, spreading his hands. "I'm just a concerned neighbor who doesn't want to see blood spilled. The Army has no love for the Lakota, and if they're planning an action—" "Where is Wanbley?" Sarah asked suddenly, noticing his absence from the gathering. A shadow crossed Dakota's face. "He went to your farm last night to seek the truth for himself. He has not returned." Cold fear gripped Sarah's heart. "We need to find him. Now." "Why?" Jenkins asked. "So you can silence him too if he's discovered something incriminating." Sarah ignored him, keeping her focus on Dakota. "Chief, I give you my word I have not betrayed our alliance. Jenkins is the spy, not me. He's working for Montgomery, trying to divide us." Dakota studied her face intently. For a moment, Sarah thought she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Then his expression hardened again. "Until Wanbley returns, we cannot know the truth," he said finally. "You will leave our lands now, Mrs. Blackwood. Our alliance is suspended." "Dakota, please, go," he said firmly, "before blood is shed where it need not be." With no choice but to comply, Sarah turned her horse and rode back toward her farm, heart heavy with the knowledge that Montgomery's scheme had succeeded. The alliance was broken, at least temporarily, and somewhere Wanbley was missing, possibly in danger. As she rode, Sarah became aware of hoofbeats behind her. Glancing back, she saw Jenkins following at a distance. When he realized she had spotted him, he urged his horse forward until he drew alongside her. "Unfortunate business," he said, shaking his head regretfully. "I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but the Lakota deserve to know the truth." "The only truth," Sarah replied coldly, "is that you're a liar and a spy. Whatever harm comes to Wanbley, it's on your head." Jenkins's mask of sympathy fell away, replaced by a hard smile that transformed his entire face. "Mrs. Blackwood, you really should have taken Montgomery's offer when it was generous. Now I'm afraid the terms will be considerably less favorable." "I'm not selling my land," Sarah stated. "Not to Montgomery, not to anyone." "Well, I think you might reconsider," Jenkins replied, "especially when you learn what's happened to your Lakota friend." Sarah's hand moved to her rifle, but Jenkins was faster, pulling a pistol from inside his coat. "I wouldn't," he warned. "I'm not authorized to kill you yet, but accidents do happen." They rode in tense silence until they reached the fork where their paths would diverge, Jenkins toward the Miller property, Sarah toward her farm. "One more thing," Jenkins said as they paused at the crossroads. "Montgomery sends his regards. He says to tell you that water always finds the path of least resistance." His smile turned cruel. "So should you." With that, he turned his horse and rode away, leaving Sarah alone with her fear for Wanbley and the bitter knowledge that the alliance she had worked so hard to build lay in ruins. The farm was eerily quiet when Sarah returned. No sign of disturbance, no indication that Wanbley had been there. She searched the house, the barn, the outbuildings, nothing. As daylight began to fade, Sarah made a decision. If Wanbley had come looking for evidence, he might have gone to the one place where Michael had kept his most important documents, the old cave in the ridge beyond the north pasture. Michael had discovered the natural formation years ago and used it as a private office of sorts, a place to work on his irrigation designs away from the distractions of the farm. Few knew of its existence, but Wanbley, who had helped Michael map the underground water channels, was one of them. Sarah saddled a fresh horse and rode hard for the ridge, reaching the narrow trail that led to the cave entrance just as the last light was fading from the sky. She dismounted, lighting the small lantern she had brought, and made her way cautiously up the path. The entrance was well concealed behind a stand of juniper trees, visible only if you knew exactly where to look. As Sarah approached, she noticed fresh boot prints in the soft earth. Someone had been here recently. She drew her pistol with her free hand, holding the lantern high with the other, and entered the cave. The main chamber was much as she remembered it, a natural hollow in the rock, expanded slightly by human hands, with a rough wooden table and chair that Michael had dragged up piece by piece. Maps and diagrams were still pinned to the rock walls, and an old chest contained journals and surveys from his years of work on the irrigation system. But something was different. The chest had been opened, its contents disturbed. Papers lay scattered across the table, and several maps were missing from the walls. "Wanbley," Sarah called softly, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. A groan from the shadows at the back of the cave answered her. Sarah rushed forward, raising her lantern to illuminate the source of the sound. Wanbley lay crumpled against the far wall, blood matting his hair and staining the front of his shirt. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, but he was conscious, struggling to sit up as Sarah knelt beside him. "Easy," she murmured, setting down her lantern to examine his injuries. "What happened?" "Jenkins," Wanbley managed through split lips. "And two others, waiting here when I came." "How badly are you hurt?" Sarah asked, professional detachment taking over as she checked for broken bones. "Not dying," Wanbley replied with a ghost of his usual stoicism. "Took maps, Michael's maps of Waterpass." Sarah glanced at the disturbed papers. "The underground channels?" Wanbley nodded painfully. "And explosives plans. How to change water direction." The implications were chilling. With Michael's detailed maps, Montgomery would know exactly where to place charges to permanently divert the creek away from both Sarah's farm and the Lakota lands, directing it instead toward whatever mining operation he was planning. "We need to warn Dakota," Sarah said. "Jenkins has turned him against me, but he might still listen to you." Wanbley grimaced as he tried to stand. "Cannot ride yet." "Then I'll go," Sarah decided. "You rest here where it's safe." But Wanbley caught her arm. "Not safe. Jenkins knows this place now. And—" he hesitated. "Dakota may not believe you. Jenkins has poisoned his mind." "Then what do we do?" Sarah asked, frustration edging her voice. "Just wait for Montgomery to blow up the creek bed." Wanbley's one good eye held hers steadily. "No, we follow Jenkins. Find maps. Stop Montgomery ourselves." The plan was dangerous, perhaps suicidal, but Sarah saw the logic in it. With the alliance broken and time running out, direct action might be their only option. "You're in no condition to travel," she pointed out. "We'll be by morning," Wanbley insisted. "Injuries look worse than are." Sarah knew better, but she also recognized the determination in his face. "Fine. We'll rest here tonight, then follow Jenkins's trail at first light." As she helped Wanbley to a more comfortable position and tended his wounds with the limited supplies she had brought, Sarah's mind turned to the deeper question that had been troubling her. "Wanbley," she asked quietly, "why did you come here alone? Why not bring other warriors if you suspected a trap?" Wanbley was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, tinged with shame. "Montgomery has my sister." Sarah's hand stilled. "What?" "Mina, youngest sister. She went to Fort Creek 2 days ago to trade. Did not return." Wanbley's good eye fixed on the cave wall, avoiding Sarah's gaze. "Yesterday Jenkins came to me alone. Said Montgomery has her. Said if I help break alliance between you and Dakota, she goes free." Understanding dawned. "That's why you didn't defend me when Jenkins accused me to Dakota." Khan, Wanblee nodded painfully. Was going to give them maps, tell Dakota you betrayed us. Then Mina would be safe. His voice broke slightly. But when I came here, saw Michael's words in his journal, to be a man is to keep water flowing for the thirsty, not for those who hold the knife. He finally met Sarah's eyes. Could not betray Michael's memory, your trust. So I fought them instead. And they took the maps anyway. Sarah finished for him. Yes, but not all. Ematam. Wanblee reached painfully inside his shirt and withdrew a folded piece of paper. Kept most important one. Map of secret valve Michael built. Can flood lower valley if opened. Sarah took the paper with shaking hands. She had forgotten about the emergency valve, a failsafe Michael had designed in case the dam ever threatened to break catastrophically during spring floods. It would release water in a controlled direction away from the farm and village. If Montgomery sets charges based on other maps, Wanblee continued, but we open this valve first. The water would undermine their entire operation, Sarah realized. It could work. She carefully refolded the map. But we'd still need to find where they're planning to set the charges and when. And find Mina, Wanblee added quietly. Sarah placed a hand gently on his shoulder. We'll find her, I promise. As the night deepened around the hidden cave, Sarah kept watch while Wanblee slept fitfully. The lantern burned low, casting long shadows across Michael's old maps and diagrams. In their flickering light, Sarah could almost imagine her husband working at the rough table, plotting the intricate paths that water might take through the valley. I'll protect what you built, she whispered to his memory, whatever it takes. And we will. Dawn was still hours away, but already Sarah's mind was racing, planning their next move. The alliance with the Lakota might be broken, but she and Wanblee still stood together. It would have to be enough. With Montgomery's men now in possession of Michael's maps, time was running out for Black Creek Valley and for the life-giving water that flowed through it. The autumn sun cast long shadows across Black Creek Valley as Sarah Blackwood stood on the newly constructed observation platform overlooking the rebuilt dam. Below her, the irrigation system, an innovative blend of Michael's engineering and traditional Lakota water management, functioned with quiet efficiency, distributing the creek's flow evenly between her flourishing fields and the Lakota lands to the north. Quite a view, remarked Marshal Reynolds, who had ridden in that morning from Bismarck. 2 years had added streaks of gray to his beard, but his eyes remained sharp and observant. Hard to believe this was all underwater when I first arrived. Nature heals quickly with proper tending, Sarah replied, adjusting the leather glove that now habitually covered her left hand, the lingering reminder of the bullet wound that had never fully healed. So do communities with the right leadership. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. Which is why I'm here. Washington is taking notice of what you've accomplished with the Lakota. This water-sharing agreement is being discussed as a possible model for other territories. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Washington noticing Native Americans without planning to relocate them? That's a pleasant surprise. Don't get too optimistic, Reynolds cautioned. It's more that some forward-thinking officials see economic advantages in stability. He paused, removing an official-looking envelope from his coat. Nevertheless, they've sent this. Sarah opened the envelope to find formal recognition of the Black Creek Water Compact, the agreement she and Dakota had drafted together, establishing shared rights and responsibilities for the creek that sustained them both. It bore the signatures of several federal officials, including the territorial governor. This makes it official, Reynolds explained. The first federally recognized water-sharing agreement between settlers and a native tribe. It's a small victory, but significant. Thank you, Sarah said, genuinely moved. This means more than I can express. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, now expanded to serve as a meeting place for the Joint Water Commission that oversaw the agreement, Reynolds's expression grew more serious. There's another reason for my visit, he admitted. I've received reports of unusual activity to the west. Surveying parties, men with mining equipment. Word is they're working for Western Continental Railroad. Sarah stopped walking. Montgomery's old company. The very same, though, under new management since his conviction. Reynolds studied her reaction. They appear to be scouting a route that would cut through the far edge of Lakota territory near the western tributary of Black Creek. That land is protected under our agreement, Sarah said sharply. The railroad may argue that the agreement only explicitly covers the main branch of the creek, not its tributaries. Reynolds sighed. It's a legal gray area they're clearly hoping to exploit. Sarah's jaw tightened. Have you informed Juan Bly? Not yet. Thought you should know first, given your particular relationship. Sarah chose to ignore the implication in his tone. Her friendship with Wanbley now, Chief Wanbley since Dakota's peaceful passing the previous winter, had been the subject of gossip in Fort Creek, despite its purely platonic nature. Their shared commitment to maintaining the water agreement had created a bond that transcended cultural boundaries, but nothing more. I'll ride to the village tomorrow, she decided. Better he hears it from me than through rumors. Reynolds nodded. There's more. The surveys aren't just for a railroad. They're looking for coal deposits. If they find what they think is there, they'll need water for extraction, a lot of water. Sarah understood immediately the threat this posed to their carefully balanced system. Precisely. And unlike Montgomery, they'll come with government backing and eminent domain claims. Reynolds looked genuinely concerned. This won't be a battle fought with guns, Sarah. It'll be fought with lawyers and legislation. Harry then will need to be prepared on those fronts too, Sarah replied, her mind already racing through possibilities. Daniel's position as sheriff gives us some local authority, and with the federal recognition of our agreement, they reached the farmhouse where several members of the Joint Commission, a mixture of settlers and Lakota, were gathering for their monthly meeting. Among them was Mina Wanbley's sister, who had emerged as a surprisingly effective diplomat between the two communities. Her experiences during Montgomery's attacks had given her unique insights into both worlds. Marshal Reynolds. Mina greeted him with a respectful nod. Your presence honors us. The honor is mine, Reynolds replied. Your brother is not attending today. He sends his regrets. There's been some disturbance at our western hunting grounds, strangers asking questions, marking trees. Mina's eyes met Sarah's. He's gone to investigate. Sarah and Reynolds exchanged knowing glances. The railroad, Sarah said quietly. They're already starting. As the commission members filed into the house, Sarah paused on the porch, looking out over the valley she had fought so hard to protect. The battle against Montgomery had nearly cost her everything, but it had also given her something she never expected: a community that bridged two worlds united by their shared dependence on the life-giving water of Black Creek. Now that community faced a new threat, one that couldn't be fought with rifles and dynamite, but with words and laws and political will. The Western Continental Railroad represented progress in the eyes of many, making it a far more formidable opponent than a single greedy businessman. Sarah's hand went unconsciously to the leather-bound journal she kept in her pocket, Michael's final journal, which she had found in the cave during the conflict with Montgomery. In it, he had written of his vision for the valley, not just coexistence between settlers and Lakota, but true collaboration, each enriching the other with their knowledge and traditions. We will protect what you built, she whispered to his memory, whatever it takes. Later that evening, after the commission meeting had concluded and Reynolds had departed with promises of support from his office, Sarah sat alone at her desk, drafting a letter to a lawyer in Bismarck who specialized in water rights. As she wrote, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Daniel Peterson stood on her porch, his expression grave. As Fort Creek sheriff, he had matured from the tentative storekeeper into a respected lawman, though the scars from his desperate ride for help during Montgomery's attack still marked his face. Sarah, he said without preamble, riders just came through town. Engineers from Western Continental heading for the Western Tributary. But they're not alone. He hesitated. They've got Jackson Van Cleef's younger brother with them, Mason Van Cleef. Word is he's been hired as their security consultant. Sarah felt a chill run through her. Mason Van Cleef had been mentioned in his brother's confession, a more ruthless, less principled version of Jackson, with none of the older Van Cleef's occasional flashes of honor. He's been asking questions, Daniel continued, about you, about Wanbley, about what happened 2 years ago. He's looking for revenge, Sarah realized aloud, among other things. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. There's more. One of the engineers lets slip that they've already found coal deposits, significant ones. They're planning a major mining operation with a new town to support it. They're calling it New Providence, supposedly a fresh start for the territory. Sarah thought of the fragile piece they had built of the balanced water system that sustained both her farm and the Lakota village of Michael's dream that was finally beginning to take root. All of it now threatened by the combined forces of corporate greed, governmental indifference, and personal vengeance. "When does Wanblee return from the western grounds?" she asked. "Tomorrow, according to Mina," Daniel replied. "But Sarah, we can't fight the railroad the way we fought Montgomery. They're too powerful." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, remembering the flood that had saved them, before water unleashed as both destroyer and savior. Such dramatic measures wouldn't work this time. This would require a different kind of courage, a different kind of strategy. "We're not going to fight them, Daniel," she said, finally opening her eyes with new resolve. "We're going to change them or stop them before they can begin." She reached for her coat. "Saddle the horses. We need to get to the western tributary before Wanblee confronts those surveyors alone." As they rode out under the rising moon, Sarah thought of all that had been sacrificed to bring peace to Black Creek Valley. She would not let that sacrifice be in vain. The railroad mason Van Cleef, the coal mining operation, they represented a new chapter in the struggle for the valley's soul, one that would require all the wisdom, courage, and unity that she and her unlikely allies could muster. The water had brought them together once before in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Now it would do so again, flowing like a silver thread through their intertwined destinies, leading them toward a future that none of them could yet fully imagine. As the sun sets over Black Creek Valley, the water flows along paths both old and new, much like the people whose lives it sustains. A battle for mere survival transformed into something far greater, the birth of an unlikely alliance forged in bloodshed, but tempered by shared sacrifice. Sarah Blackwood lost her dam, half her farm, and nearly her life defending what her husband built, while the Lakota lost warriors, a sacred lodge, and old certainties about who could be trusted. Yet from these losses emerged an understanding rarely seen in these contested lands. Water, once a boundary between worlds, became the thread that bound them together. The scars remain in the landscape, reshaped by flood in Sarah's damaged hand, in Wanblee's eyes as he leads his people forward, in the memory of those who fell defending what mattered most. But scars also mark where healing has occurred. Some will say it was just about gold or land or survival. But those who witnessed what happened at Black Creek know differently. They understand that sometimes the most profound courage isn't found in conquering new territories, but in learning to share the ones we already inhabit. In a land where so many fought to claim what others already possessed, who would have thought that it would be water flowing freely belonging to no one and everyone that finally taught us how to live together.